Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Middle East Studies lecture series. My name is Bishar Dumani. I'm Director of Middle East Studies. We have a tradition here. We don't do introductions. Everyone should have in front of you a sheet with all the relevant information. But because this is simulcast and will be recorded later, and I know people will be watching it later, I'll just say a couple of quick words as people still are walking in from getting their food. First of all, I must thank Rida Mustafa from the French department here at Brown University, who first suggested that Larry should come and talk about his new book. And this is, by the way, a book signing event. So if you go outside, you'll see a table with this book, beautifully produced book with a great cover, which is actually the topic of the talk today. And it's called The Singing Turk, Ottoman Power and Operatic Emotions on the European Stage from the Siege of Vienna to the Age of Napoleon. I mean, every key word I can think of that should make this an exciting book is there, but what you'll find out once you read it is actually even more exciting than the title itself. So this lecture and the book will consider the huge cultural phenomena of operas about Turks that played out across the stages of Europe from the 1680s to the 1820s. And Professor Larry Wolff has dabbled into this, he told me last night, not being in music and not being an Ottoman historian, but often that is the best way to come at a subject kind of sideways and come up with different ways of looking at material that would never occur to actual people who are specialized in just this specific topic. So I think that's actually a great thing. He's a Julius Silver Professor of History at New York University and Director of the NYU Center for European and Mediterranean Studies. And his research is focused on the relation between Eastern Europe and Western Europe, especially pursuing the argument that Eastern Europe was, quote unquote, invented in the 18th century by the philosophers and travelers of the Enlightenment. And I would urge you to take a look at his other books, which have a very wide range of interests and how he pursues this argument. So without further ado, Professor Larry Wolff.
Thanks very much for that introduction. I'm very grateful to Bashara and to Urida for bringing me here to Brown to speak about the book. As Bashar mentioned, I'm not an Ottomanist and I'm not a musicologist, and I feel very humble about presenting this material to people, some of whom will know much more than I do about aspects of this subject. So I come to it as a little bit of an outsider. I was invited to present a paper connected to Turkish subjects in opera at a conference, and I began to delve into it, and the only thing I knew about it was Mozart's famous Abduction from the Seraglio, 1782. You're looking at a performance of it there. There's tiny little Mozart trying to watch a performance in Berlin last year of his life. And it's an opera about the encounter between a Turk and a Christian European, right? And you can see that that encounter is dramatized on the stage. You can see it in costume. You can also hear it in the music. What I didn't know when I started working on this and trying to say a few things about the Abduction from the Seraglio is that there are, in fact, hundreds of operas on these kinds of subjects from the 18th century, most of them completely forgotten, but they are performed all over Europe from the 1680s to the 1820s, that they're a whole huge cultural phenomenon in their own right, and then somewhat mysteriously they vanish after the 1820s from the major operatic repertory. And I thought that it would be interesting to try to chart their existence over this period of almost 150 years and try to figure out what they meant. I mean, just to give away the story, and very quickly, the most important things that I think they come to mean are connected to issues of how absolute power is exercised both in the state and in the family, and how extreme emotions are vocalized and contained in 18th century society. And one of the things I would say about it is that the Turk who stands at the center, right, this is the abduction from the Seraglio that you're looking at again from an early 19th century production, right? He's exotic in his costume, but he is recognizable to European publics, and he dramatizes issues that are familiar to Europeans and that they recognize in themselves. And that and for that reason, the singing Turk on the European stage is not altogether an exotic, but someone with whom Europeans are able to identify through his music. The Ottoman Empire is not a fantasy theatrical space. It's a real space on the map in early modern Europe. It exists on 3 continents, in Africa, Asia, and Europe. And in fact, the Ottoman Empire goes deep into Europe from the 16th to the 18th century, is an integral part of Europe during the early modern period. And it's no surprise that Europeans are able to recognize some of their European selfhood in Ottoman figures. The part of Europe that I was most interested in is the part of Europe that early modern historians call the triplex confinium. You can see there's a point right over here where you have a triple border. The Ottoman Empire meeting the green Venetian Republic, meeting the pink of the Austrian Habsburg monarchy. That triple border is a place, sometimes an armed triple border and a site of warfare in the 18th century, but it's also a site of commercial exchange, cultural encounter, and a place of familiarity where Venetians, Habsburg subjects, and Ottoman subjects recognize each other across the border. And from my point of view, the thing that was really interesting about this triplex confinium, wait for me so I don't have to jump. That's a nice view. There's the triplex confinium. Thank you, Malcolm. The thing that was most interesting about it is that the 2 capitals of Venice and Vienna, of the Venetian Republic and the Habsburg Empire, respectively, are not just political capitals, but they're huge opera capitals in the 18th century and sites for operatic production. And really, probably the 2 most important places that I was interested in, and places where I did research for this project. The presence of Turks in Habsburg monarchy and in Venice is well known. There's a Fondaco dei Turchi in Venice, which tells us about the presence of Turkish merchants in Venice. And of course, there's a great Venetian merchant presence in Istanbul as well during the 18th century. The first thing that I did was I tried to map the production of these operas against major dates in international relations in the 18th century, and to think about the ways, now that I have a pointer, in which operas cluster around these early wars between the Ottoman Empire and the European powers, around the Russian-Ottoman War of 1768 to 1774, which is the first war that the major European powers sit out and watch the Russians fight. And then finally, especially the Napoleonic Wars, and then the beginnings of the national wars of independence, especially the Greek War of Independence in the 1820s. The starting point for the subject is the Siege of Vienna in 1683 and the formation of the Holy League in 1684. As you probably know, there's an Ottoman army outside of Vienna in 1683 for the second time laying siege to the city. It was present at the beginning of the 16th century as well in 1529. And it's a failed siege in 1683. The siege is relieved by Christian armies coming down from the Kahlenberg mountain to break the siege of Vienna, which you see down below inside of its walls. And there's then formed a Holy League under the auspices of the Pope, which drives the Ottoman Empire back through Hungary, and Hungary is conquered for the Habsburg monarchy from the Ottomans in the 1680s. It's these events, lifting of the Siege of Vienna in 1683, successful wars of the Holy League in the 1680s, pushing back the Ottoman Empire, which for the first time suggests to European powers that the Ottoman Empire is not invincible. And astonishingly, by the end of the decade, you see the very first opera about Turks appear on the stage in Venice. Doesn't take long. By the end of the decade, it's happening in 1689 in Venice, in the theater of San Giovanni Paolo. You have an opera, Il Gran Tamerlano, which is about the encounter between Tamerlane and the Sultan Bayezid. With the Sultan Bayezid unusually playing out as the hero of the musical opera. Now, what we would say about this, I think, right, it's fairly simplistic, but I think it's pretty clear that the moment after the lifting of the siege of Vienna, when the Ottomans no longer seem invincible, is the moment at which it becomes possible to imagine them operatically on the stage and to imagine them with positive virtues on the stage operatically, especially since Bayezid's positive virtues on the stage are the virtues of pride and dignity in defeat and captivity, because Bayezid loses the Battle of Ankara to Tamerlane in 1402, and according to legend is kept in a cage by Tamerlane. This was very important to European legendry of Bayezid. We know for sure he was kept in captivity. Whether the cage actually existed is a mere source of speculation and romance, perhaps. But the idea of Bayezid's captivity, carried out under conditions of great dignity and stoical resolve, eventually leading to his death in 1403, is one that holds the European stage from the end of the 1680s throughout the entire 18th century. The most important versions are created in Venice, on the triplex Confinium, Venice, which is involved in the Holy War of the 1680s and into the Holy League Wars from the 1680s into the 1690s. Bayezid, Imperatore dei Turchi, is placed on the stage as a heroic figure and is impersonated, is sung, is vocalized by Signor Francesco Rossini, who becomes the most famous interpreter. There's a tenor who's famous for being Bayezid on the stages of Europe in the early 18th century. And in fact, he radically expands the potential of the tenor repertory through the figure of Bayezid and ends up creating for Gasparini and then for Handel in London, first for Gasparini in Venice and then for Handel in London, a famous death scene, the first great death scene for tenor on stage in the history of opera. Bayezid, the Turkish Sultan, becomes his vehicle to stardom in the early 18th century. What I want to emphasize for you is how this figure of Bayezid moves across the stages of Europe, often with Rossini as his advocate. Rossini, who actually takes Gasparini's score and carries it to London and presents it to Handel and says, this is what I need you to compose for me. This is the role that I need you to compose for me. Gasparini, who composes it first in a Venetian context, and when Gasparini composes, this is what it sounds like. Notice the heroic lyrics, right? Son tra ceppi, I am in chains, right? That's Bayezid. But forte e lieto a morte andrei, strong and glad I would go to my death, except for his concern about his daughter. So what I want to emphasize for you first is how Handel, who has Gasparini's score and who has the libretto by Piovene, which emerges from Venice, produces a work which is an aria to the same text, which you'll see is remarkably similar. I want to emphasize that this is a genre. Handel, the greater genius, but working within a framework. Nicer, huh? Right? Could not be more positive in its representation of the Ottoman Sultan, who was meant to be a model in this opera of what it means to face your death with courage and resolve under circumstances of captivity. I don't think it's accidental that these are the circumstances in which Europeans can admire an Ottoman Sultan on the stage, singing stoically about the acceptance of death in captivity. For Rossini, it's the defining work of his career. You can see in the Handel, it's written, his name is written into the score, sung by Signor Borsino, right? And the death scene, which is what you were looking at there before, is the one in which Rossini is most heavily invested, in which he shows what he can do. And Handel puts a lot of effort into this, as Gasparini does as well, to create a complicated scena that makes a complicated scene that makes use of recitative accompanied by full orchestra, recitative morphing into aria and arioso as it proceeds. And as I said, it's probably the most complex scene for tenor created up until this moment in the operatic literature. There's Tamerlane. And then the orchestra. He's poisoned himself. So my death, right, becomes my chosen triumph for Bayezid. It's a scene that goes on for some 10 to 12 minutes, with which the tenor performs his death on stage and becomes Rossini's signature. The other thing you'll notice about the character of Bayezid is that he's distinguished from Tamerlane by his tenor voice. The voice of Tamerlane is the voice of a castrato, right, who would be the more usual hero in 18th century opera. The castrato who played the role for Handel in London is caricatured here, Pacini, and one of the places where you really feel Bayezid's absence after his death, and something which Handel really dramatizes by absence, is the final duet for the two castrati who are left alive on stage, in which you hear very poignantly the tenor voice that's missing. Very beautiful ending for the Byzantine prince and the Central Asian conqueror who survive, but the absence of the tenor is really notable when you're listening to the two castrati who are singing together at the end. Now, I've told you this is performed all over Europe in the 18th century, just a small sample, right, if you wanted a set of the places where this work is performed, beginning in Venice in 1689 and ending in Venice in 1799, often making use of the very same libretto that was created by Pioveni for Gasparini in 1711. So it really travels around the continent in multiple settings, and this is just a sampling of them. I want to turn from the tragedy of Bayezid to the more usual subject that, or the more usual genre for discussing Turkish subjects in opera in the 18th century, which is comedy. Beginning in the Paris fairs of the early 18th century, we begin to see musical comedies about Turkish captivity performed for popular audiences in the fairs. This one is called Harlequin, Sultan Favorite. Harlequin, the favorite sultana, right, in which Harlequin is taken captive by the Sultan and is in the harem, veiled. The Sultan is about to remove the veil and discover that it's Harlequin and not a beautiful woman who is in his harem, right? There are musical comedies, and there are a genre of musical comedies which take over the opera stages of Europe beginning in the 1730s in particular. They move from the fairs into the opera, and it's a somewhat unusual subject, comedies of captivity, because captivity is a real thing in the early modern centuries, a real thing in the 18th century. There are, over the course of the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries on the Mediterranean, tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands of captives taken, sold into slavery, both Christians in the Ottoman Empire and Muslims in Christian Europe, going both ways. And it's not an obviously funny subject. All of these operas are presented as comedy, in which the captives are finally rescued or more usually liberated in the final scene of the opera. They date from a period following the siege of Vienna, but also following the almost simultaneous French bombardment of Algiers in 1682, in which European powers have actually begun to intervene to attempt to control piracy on the Mediterranean, which you see in the case of Algiers already in the 1680s. But there are Venetian wars in the 1780s, a centuries later, and famously the Americans are in Tripoli in 1804 fighting against piracy. It's where the Shores of Tripoli enters into the Marines' anthem. The Americans are also involved in fighting piracy in the Mediterranean in the early 19th century. Captives are often in the 17th century ransomed by monastic orders. You can see that taking place here. Monks ransoming captives from the Turks. On the operatic stage, nothing as crude as ransom ever takes place. Instead, what usually happens is that the Turkish ruler himself, a sultan, a pasha, a bey, emancipates his captives out of the generosity of his heart. And the genre of these comedies is the genre of the Turk généreux, the generous Turk, right, who comes to the Paris Opera in 1735 with Rameau, to the Vienna Ballet, which is what you're actually looking at here, elaborately staged with a generous Turk at the center who, beautifully costumed, generously emancipates his captives. And we have a genre in which the Turkish ruler represents to European publics the generous face of absolute rule, which is meant to be a model for European rulers and thinking about what absolute rule means in the 18th century. In Rameau, the generous Turk is so generous that he is sentimental as he says farewell to the captive whom he loves and whom he liberates. He sings avec douleur, with grief. Everyone else is happy, but the Sultan is sad. Right? a Turk who is full of sensibility and emotion, which moves his heart and is meant to move your heart as well as a part of as the public. When I thought about titles for this book, I thought about calling it "Remember Osman," "Souvenez-vous d'Osman," because of course these are about forgotten operas and forgotten scenes of operas from operas that we don't remember anymore and that we don't perform anymore. This is sometimes performed in France. The greatest hit of the Paris generous Turk phenomenon came in 1761 with a work called Les Trois Sultanes, the Three Sultanas, right? It was performed at the Comédie Italienne. It's created by an impresario named Charles-Simon Favart, who's involved in the creation of the Opéra Comique in the middle of the 18th century. And it has at its center the historical sultan, perhaps the greatest of the sultans, Suleiman the Magnificent, the 16th century sultan, who here becomes the subject of a musical comedy on the Paris stage, and then not just the Paris stage, because this then also travels all over Europe, is translated into multiple European languages for the rest of the 18th century. The plot involves Suleiman the Magnificent, who has three sultanas in his harem, and he's choosing his favorite from among them. One is Circassian, one is Spanish, and the other, Roxalana, who was a historical figure, a harem sultan, right, and who was actually from Ukraine, in the opera is French, right? And he chooses her in the end for her Frenchness. She wins him over by her singing and her harp playing. The role of Roxalana is played by Madame Favart, the wife of the creator of the work. She accompanies herself on the harp, and it becomes a parable of civilization, because when Suleiman realizes his deep love for Roxalana, he converts to French civilization, right? Marries her, civilizes himself, and announces a complete reform of the Ottoman Empire following the principles of the French Enlightenment. It's a weird, counterfactual Ottoman history in which the 16th century is replayed on the 18th century stage. And the whole thing is brought to life by Madame Favart accompanying herself on the harp, right? She sings, "Oh, vous que Mars rend invincible." Right, I can't play a recording for you because no recording exists. It hasn't been performed since the 18th century, when it was performed over and over and over. It comes to Vienna, except in Vienna, Roxalana is German. It goes to Stockholm, but in Stockholm, Roxalana is Swedish, right? It becomes a story of your native civilization reforming the Ottoman Empire wherever it travels in Europe. Does not go to Russia, right? In the 1760s, Russia goes to war against the Ottoman Empire from 1768 to 1774. This is one of the turning points in Ottoman history and in Russian history, the war that ends in the Treaty of Kuchik-Kainarji in 1774. What I want to point out to you here is that in Catherine's war with the Ottoman Empire, the rest of Europe looks on for the first time, does not participate in that war. And it becomes a period of opera comedies non-stop about the Ottoman Empire. Voltaire, who is Catherine's great fan and admirer during this period, a great French philosopher, writes to Catherine, "These barbarians deserve to be punished by a heroine for the lack of consideration they have shown till now for ladies. It is clear that people who neglect all the fine arts and who shut up women deserve to be exterminated." Now, I want you to put to one side the ugliness of the sentiments, deserve to be exterminated, because what I think is in some ways more interesting about this quotation is the spirit of operatic comedy with which Voltaire enters into this discussion. People who shut up women deserve to be punished by a heroine. Catherine becomes the heroine of her own comic opera, in which women who have been liberated from harems on the operas of the stage, right, for a generation, are now being liberated by Catherine through warfare in the same spirit of comic opera, because comic opera is what accompanies this war all over Europe, one after another. Comic operas about Turks being performed from Lisbon to Vienna to Berlin to Parma to London. They proliferate during this period. The other thing that's interesting about what happens to opera about Turks during the 1760s is they begin to be marked by a Turkish style in music and a Turkish style in instrumentation, as European composers understand that. Gluck is the first one to do it. To introduce into Les Pèlerins de la Mecque, right, the pilgrims to Mecca, what he understands to be Janissary instrumentation. And we begin to hear the cymbals, the bass drum, and the bells from the moment that Gluck plays the overture in Vienna in 1764. Nope. That's Gluck's understanding of Ottoman instrumentation, the cymbal. So all of this derives from the Janissary bands who accompanied the Ottoman Janissary Corps and were actually heard in Vienna outside the walls of the city during the siege, which I showed you before. The Viennese are inside their city. The Ottoman army is outside. The Janissary bands are playing to encourage the Ottoman troops. And the besieged Viennese hear that instrumentation, which sounds different, right, when performed by the Janissary bands, whom you can actually hear perform in the Istanbul Military Museum. They actually play on the original instruments in the style of the original Janissary bands. You can see them playing there at the top. So you hear it for the first time outside the walls of Vienna in 1683. By the beginning of the 18th century, European courts are bringing Janissary bands to perform, to celebrate European princes in Dresden, in Vienna, in St. Petersburg, in Berlin. And by the middle of the 18th century, by the 1760s, Gluck has introduced it into an opera about Turkish figures in the Pilgrims of Mecca. And the instruments of the cymbals, the bells, and especially the bass drum become a little battery inside of European orchestras for the presentation of Turkish operas, with also certain an alla turca style, with certain phrases and modulations that Europeans believe to be characteristic of Turkish music, some of which is fantasy and some of which is reasonably correct and based on an imitation of how Europeans hear Janissary music performed. Most famous use of this is in Mozart's Abduction from the Seraglio in 1782. And you can see in the overture how on the ninth measure, Mozart brings, I have Meltem's pointer. Mozart brings in the ninth measure, the triangle for the bells, the piatti, the cymbals, and the tamburo grande, the bass drum, right here, transforming the piece, as the Viennese would have heard that instrumentation outside the walls of Vienna in 1683. Mozart's Abduction is a centennial piece in 1782, looking back 99 years to the coming centennial of the siege. And the Viennese hear that instrumentation again, but now on the operatic stage. They hear it again at the end of the opera, when the Janissary instrumentation is used to celebrate the generous Turk, Pasha Selim, who liberates the characters, the Europeans, and sends them home. So what does it mean for a Turkish pasha to be celebrated in that fashion musically on the European operatic stage in 1782? What you need to know about it is that while the Turkish pasha is being celebrated on the stage, watching in the audience is the Habsburg Emperor, Joseph II, who is mirrored by the Turkish pasha on the stage. And the Turkish celebration of the pasha with the Janissary instrumentation is also celebrating the Habsburg Emperor, who, surrounded by his court, stands at the center of Mozart's operatic public in 1782. The Turkish figure is meant to mirror instructively and morally the figure of the enlightened absolute ruler who is in the audience. The Turkish pasha on stage doesn't sing in the Abduction from the Seraglio. The singing Turk is the pasha's overseer, Osmin, a character on whom Mozart lavishes more attention, judging from his correspondence, than on any other character he creates. There's a very long letter in which he describes to us in great detail how he plans out this character musically. And, somehow the German hasn't come out right on that side, sorry. But you can see the excerpts over here on the right. We gave the part of Osmin to Herr Fischer, who has an outstanding bass voice. We had to take advantage of such a man, especially since he's a great favorite with the public here. So aimed at a particular vocal type, aimed at the public. Osmin's rage will be rendered comical by the use of Turkish music. That's going to be the style and the instrumentation, which is considered fundamental to the comedy. And in the composition of the aria, I let his beautiful deep tones shimmer. So it's both beautiful and comical at the same time. And then finally, the most important part of the letter, for a person who finds himself in such violent rage, and Osmin rages against the European captives who are trying to escape, he oversteps all order, measure, and purpose. He doesn't recognize himself. And so the music also must not know itself, though the passions, violent or not, must never be expressed to the point of causing disgust. And the music, even in the most horrible situation, must never offend the ear, but give pleasure, must always remain music. Right? It's meant to be a musical meditation on Mozart's part of what it means to try to create strong emotions in opera, which opera has to do, but at the same time contain them within the beauty of the music. But it's also a personal lesson for Mozart about what happens to a person who finds himself in violent rage and oversteps all order, measure, and purpose and doesn't recognize himself. That could be any of us. The person who it most notably is, in 1781 when Mozart writes the letter, is Mozart himself, who is in a rage in 1781. It's the year that he breaks with the Archbishop of Salzburg, transforms his whole life, and in a sort of fury of outrage at the structured life of a musician in the Ancien Regime, attempts to live independently in Vienna. So for Mozart, this comical Turkish overseer contains life lessons for himself and for his public and what you do with your extreme emotions. One of the things you do is you remind yourself that you have a mind, right? That you have reason in the age of Enlightenment.
Ich hab auch Verstand. Ich hab auch Verstand. Ich hab auch Verstand. Ich hab auch Verstand. Ich hab auch
So you have to sing yourself to the stability of that very, very low F. But Mozart's comical Turk is a figure who, in the spirit of the Enlightenment, has a mind, right? And reminds himself that he has a mind as he seeks to control his emotions, both musically and personally. And of course, like Mozart, he can't quite do it. And he erupts into rages against the captives. Do you hear the Janissary instrumentation behind it? And as the tempo picks up, you lose control. Mozart simulating what it would be like to lose control of your emotions if every note weren't written for you. The bass star is someone who actually makes a specialty of Turkish roles on the stages of Vienna. We could say, like Rossini as a tenor at the beginning of the century, Fischer in the middle of the century in Central Europe specializes in these Turkish roles, making use of his bass. And what Mozart is interested ultimately in doing is taking his Turkish figure and on stage harmonizing him, showing that he can be harmonized with his European counterpart, the tenor Pedrillo. Under the influence of wine and with the help of Janissary percussion, right, it turns out that they are brothers after all. Again, with the Janissary instrumentation underlining their comical unity in this case. Mozart can imagine, right, his comical Turkish figure, even with his rages, harmonizing with his Christian European counterpart. Mozart, again, we can say, normalizes Turkishness in Don Giovanni. Don Giovanni has a long list of the many women he has seduced, and it's read out in a famous catalog aria. There are 640 in Italy, there are 231 in Germany, there are 100 in France, and in Turkey there are 91, in Spain there are 1,003. But Turkey is a casual part of the enumeration of the European order for Mozart's famous seducer. Passes over Turkey so quickly you almost wouldn't notice it. But the casualness of that is the whole point, right? That Turkey is casually part of the structured universe of Europe for Mozart, and maybe more importantly for his librettist here, Lorenzo da Ponte, who comes from Venice, also from the world of the triplex confinium. And we have a Venice-Vienna axis here in the creation of this vision of a Europe that includes Turkey on the lists of Don Giovanni's conquests. The last composer who I want to speak about, and I'll be very brief, is Rossini, who comes from the Adriatic coast, belongs to the world of the Eastern Mediterranean, from Pesaro, just south of Venice, and who participates in what is the very last flowering of operas about Turkish subjects in the early 19th century. Rossini lives through an age of openness in the Ottoman Empire and of Ottoman engagement with Europe, through the age of Selim III, who sends embassies to the West in the 1790s, through the age of Mahmud II, who inaugurates the great age of Ottoman reform in the 19th century and actually abolishes the Janissaries with their Janissary bands. Rossini also lives through the age of European engagement with the Ottoman Empire, including imperial engagements and assaults on the Ottoman Empire, namely beginning with Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798. And through these years, Rossini creates three principal works, although other secondary works, that are on Turkish subjects, the last flowering of this subject, in L'Italiana in Algeri, in Turco in Italia, and Maometto II. As with Mozart, he's got a specialist whom he works with, the bass, Filippo Galli, right, who plays the Turk in all three of these operas for Rossini, right? Galli in Turkish costume is something that the Italian public is very familiar with in the beginning of the 19th century, and Galli's shimmering low notes characterize the hypermasculinity of the Turk in the same way that Fischer did that for Mozart in the 1780s. L'Italiana in Algerie has a comical Turkish bey who is deeply gratifying to the Venetian public in 1813. But I just want to spend a moment on the phenomenally bold Il Turco in Italia, which is about a Turk in Italy who is not a military conqueror, but a romantic adventurer who comes to Italy in the early 19th century to see the sights and to meet the girls. And who has a long, extended flirtation with a married Italian woman, Fiorilla, right, which is beautifully carried out between the two of them, and in which their cultural and religious difference seems to make no difference at all, except that at the very end, they must finally separate and go to their separate shores of the Mediterranean. This duet Rossini sets to just 2 lines of libretto. She sings, in Italia certamente non si fa l'amor così. In Italy, certainly, you don't make love like that. And he sings, in Turchia sicuramente non si fa l'amor così. Right, in Turkey, certainly, you don't make love like that. But when Rossini composes it, what he shows us is that they make love in exactly the same way. That's what the music tells us in spite of the libretto. Have you ever heard 2 people who are more obviously meant to be together, right, as Rossini conceives of them in Il Turco in Italia? The opera about Turks, as it moves into its final phase, right, is about a convergence of Europe and Turkey and the possibility of closeness and intimacy that you can see in Il Turco in Italia. But the last great opera that Rossini writes about Turks is an opera seria on the most daring subject of all, an opera about Mehmet II, Mehmet the conqueror of Istanbul in 1453, who struck terror into the hearts of Italian princes of the Renaissance in the 15th century, and who is rediscovered on the opera stage at the beginning of the 19th century by Rossini, composing an opera not about the conquest of Istanbul, but about the conquest of Venetian Negroponte in 1470 off the Greek coast. And it's an opera in which Mehmed II is a Turk of sensibility, like Rameau's sensitive Turk of 1735. He's in love with a Venetian girl, but he's nevertheless a conqueror and a charismatic conqueror who is at the same time the sympathetic hero and the troubled villain, right, of the opera that bears his name, because he can't help being in love, but he can't help being a conqueror at the same time. And he's celebrated as the conqueror of the world, del mondo al vincitor, in what is kind of a unique celebration of what Europeans understand to be a Muslim impulse to universal conquest. I don't know if you could hear the Janissary instrumentation, the cymbals crashing. not like celebrating Bayezid in a cage, right? This is different, right? This is celebrating Mehmet as a conqueror on the stage, and it's actually so awkward to do that when the opera is revised for Venice in 1822, they change the ending so that counterfactually, Negroponte does not fall to the Turks. Mehmet the Conqueror fails to conquer the fortress, fails to conquer Greece, and again we have a completely counterfactual history with a happy ending in which the conquest fails, right? A problematic piece clearly from the moment that it appears. Now, what does it mean to celebrate the conqueror of the world on the stage in this charismatic but conflicted fashion? All you need to know is what generation Rossini lived through, which was, of course, the generation of Napoleon and the Napoleonic conquests. Right? It's about Maometto II, but Mehmed II, Maometto II, but it's also about Napoleon, right? And the drama of universal conquest that Rossini and his whole generation had lived through in war-torn Europe from 1803 until 1815, up until Waterloo. And it's a reflection on what it means to encounter a historic conqueror in your own lifetime as well as in remote history. It's a work that Rossini revises numerous times, culminating in a very radical revision, Le Siège de Corinthe in Paris in 1826, in which the opera converges with the Greek War of Independence and becomes about the ongoing Greek War of Independence, and becomes at the same time the last major work to be written on a Turkish subject for the operatic stage. The juxtaposition of Mehmed II, and that's a costuming of Mehmed II for Paris in 1826 on the cover of the book, with Napoleon, reminds us of how very much these Turkish subjects reflect upon European issues and European values and European experiences from the 1680s to the 1820s. The most popular opera in Paris from the 1780s to the 1820s, Shoot. Oh, somehow that. You know, I could see it here in the preview, and then it was gone. Okay, so let me tell you about it, and I don't know what just happened. What just happened to it? If I can call it up later, I'll show it to you. La Caravane de Caire, The Caravan to Cairo by Gretry. Most popularly performed opera, 1780s to 1820s. It's another generous Turk opera about the captives in slavery liberated at the end. It becomes a fabric pattern. Caravan de Caire, which is what the slide is supposed to show you. People put it on their walls in France in the late 18th and the early 19th century. Can you imagine it? Scenes from the opera become a fabric pattern that people use for interior decoration, a reminder of the moment when European publics responded very, very personally and with a sense of recognition and identification to the musical world of the singing Turks. Thank you. Questions? Melton.
First, a comment. Thank you very much. This was fascinating. I'm an opera lover, and I've always looked at some of these operas that I know from different perspectives. I'm enchanted by your perspective as well. But they have been viewed very much, the little that they have been viewed. I mean, I'm not suggesting that there's a large literature on them or anything. We know that, but the operatic Turk, or Türkeri, as part of that, is considered to be an Orientalist, in an Orientalist context. You do not do so.
No. I'm actually arguing rather against that perspective in the literature, which I'm very well aware of. My sense of these works is that while they contain exoticizing aspects, often connected to costume and stage setting, that the Turkish figure himself, as he vocalizes himself, is one whom Europeans recognize and are familiar with, especially as this phenomenon originates in the world of Venice, in the world of Vienna, where Turks are not unfamiliar figures, right, within those polities, and that in fact, in the 19th century age of high Orientalism, these figures vanish from opera. I mean, Orientalism, right, must be recognized as something fundamental for thinking about European culture. But in the high age of Orientalism that is connected to the making of empires, and I would say in the case of the Ottoman Empire, following especially the French adventure in Algeria, which begins in 1830, that we see these operas vanish. They don't flourish in the context of high Orientalism. They belong to an era in which, under the aegis of the Enlightenment, under the influence of a certain familiarity with Turks and Turkish subjects, even as I've suggested to you, even with the sound of actual Turkish music, these are figures whom European publics also recognize and identify with. I would qualify that and say who they partly recognize and identify with. Part of what makes the Turk such an interesting vehicle for Europeans is that they can identify with him, but don't have to identify with him entirely. He's just different enough so that you can, if you like, set him apart from yourself, but you can also, if you're willing, recognize yourself in him. I didn't talk about this at all, but one of the operas that I think is most interesting for this subject is Mozart's Così fan tutte, in which the Italian lovers disguise themselves as Ottoman Albanians. Disguising yourself as an Ottoman Albanian is as simple as changing your costume and putting on a false mustache. Right, it's about facial hair and costume. You're the same person, but your own girlfriends don't recognize you anymore. Once you've transformed yourself by costume and mustache. And it's a little bit of a dramatization of how simple it is, right, in the world of 18th century stagecraft to imagine moving back and forth between an Ottoman identity and a European identity. I mean, it takes place off stage, right? In between, the opening scene and the middle scenes of Act One.
Well, I wholeheartedly agree with you, so I'm very pleased to see your perspective. I always also wanted to look at them as part of more of an enlightenment, despite what Voltaire has written about the Turks. But I think music puts it another level. Thank you so much. This is very good. Thank you.
Yes, let me echo Melton's comments. A wonderful subject and a wonderful lecture. I think I have Aeschylus's Persians on the brain because I'm teaching later this afternoon. And there, I gather the classicists have struggled to explain the sympathetic portrayal of the Of Xerxes' army. So the defeat, even though the Achaemenids basically invade Greece and are defeated. But Aeschylus's play portrays the defeated Persians in this very sympathetic light, and scholars have sort of tried to make sense of why that was the case. And your comment about how after the defeat of the Ottomans in Vienna, all of a sudden it made it possible to deal with the subject matter, and then after that it seemed like every time there was some sort of a defeat or some sort of military encounter, you get this rash of plays. Why is that?
Is it surprising that culture would respond to international relations?
But they respond with the sympathetic portrayals. It's very interesting.
In the case of the Siege of Vienna, I think that you would say you respond to a sympathetic portrayal to the defeated enemy, in a way that you would not have been able to respond to the enemy if he had defeated you. That it's precisely defeat that makes it possible for you to respond sympathetically. Of course, the Persians are, very fundamental for the world of the Enlightenment also. They don't figure as prominently in opera during the 18th century, though they're not absolutely absent. Crucial for the Enlightenment because Montesquieu's Persian letters are founding text of the Enlightenment, and thinking about the relations and analogies and possible comparisons between Persians and Europeans is something that Enlightenment thinkers are really interested in doing with Montesquieu. But they don't know Persians the way that they know Ottomans. Persians don't have the same intimacy with Europe that Ottomans do in the 18th century, and it is more fantastic and speculative and philosophical in the case of Montesquieu than many of the engagements with Ottoman subjects.
I understood it a little differently. I understand that military defeat can do what you demonstrated can be done, but not civilizational defeat. So it stops in 1820s or 1830 because then there's a civilizational defeat in a way.
Of the Turks.
Of the Turks.
Yes, at the
Yeah.
moment of the beginning of Tanzimat.
Right. So, which is precisely the moment that supposedly they're following Europe's template, right? So that's how I read it.
I think that's right.
So my question is about something else, if that's okay. Yeah. This juxtaposition of Napoleon and the singing Turk just reminds me of a recurring theme in your talk, which is it's not about the Turks at all, right?
I wouldn't say that it's not about the
I'm
Turks
just gonna-
at all,
Yeah, no, I'm
but
I'm
it's
sure.
not only about the Turks.
Well, I'm just pushing a little bit here because you made three observations. One is about the Habsburg Emperor being at the center of the audience, but also at the center of the stage at the same time. One about Napoleon, the universal conqueror, and I'm now forgetting the third, but example that you gave where really what they're trying to do is talk about European rulers. So, so my question is, to what extent, other than using some of the Janissary martial music to kind of give the trigger that this is about the Turks, and the costumes obviously, but how is it about the Turks otherwise?
So the issues that are dramatized for Europeans
Yeah.
are issues that are not merely pasted on to Turkish scenarios, that is to say, issues of absolutism in government
Right.
are interesting to Europeans to think about as applied to Turkey and as applied to Europe. In issues of relations between men and women, as dramatized in the harem context of Turkish operas, also have an applicability to European relations between men and women, and I think that's acknowledged in operatic comedies about on these subjects. But they're also relevant for thinking about the Ottoman Empire. I think that the Ottoman sort of representations are meant to be serious, and we see that in some of the historical scenarios in particular. That is to say, if you were to think about this one, the idea, right? It is clearly references Napoleon, but Negroponte, 1470. That's something that could only matter to Venetians, right? Who, I mean, when you bring it to Venice, you're bringing it to a public that actually sees this as part of their own history and the history of their own engagement with the Ottomans over the course of centuries. Negroponte would mean nothing to anyone else, right, except for people who are connected to a Venetian historical tradition. And eventually it vanishes from the scenario when the opera is moved to Paris in 1826. Negroponte is eliminated altogether. The further you are from Venice, the less relevant it is. So what I want to say is that Ottoman history is a meaningful part of history in Venice, in Vienna. These operas coincide with history writing and political writing outside of the genre of opera. The creation of opera in Vienna concerning the Ottomans coincides with the early education of the young Hammer von Burgstall, right, who is becoming an Ottomanist at that moment, and the kind of interest that the operas suggest about about the Ottomans is one that is not only present in opera, but runs through other genres of European scholarship, letters, as you mentioned, Turkery, painting, costume, in such a fashion that I think you would have to understand the engagement with Ottoman issues as being really meaningful. I don't see it as being, frivolous or, sometimes it's, so let me make a distinction. I think it's a little different in Paris, right? I didn't talk about this in the lecture, but I mentioned to you that, say, for Venice and Vienna, right, I see the engagement as being direct, right? The Venetians know Turks, right? Turks are present in their city all the time, right? They all know people who have been in Istanbul and who have traded in Istanbul. They're connected to every aspect of Venetian life. Paris is different from Venice and Vienna, right? The idea of the Suleiman falling in love with a French woman and reforming his whole empire in the spirit of the French, right? That's closer to what you might call one of Montesquieu's Persian fantasies, right? From the greater distance of Paris, you see a somewhat more fantastical approach to the Turks, and a greater readiness to bend them to your own philosophical purposes. From closer up, from Venice and Vienna, you see something like a more serious engagement with Ottoman issues. That said, for the preposterous scenario of Les Trois Sultanes, right, the three sultanas, Favar actually had all the costumes made in Istanbul for the first performance in 1761. He actually cared enough about authenticity to actually have them made there and brought to Paris, and that was part of the advertisement of what the show was able to present, as well as Madame Favar playing the harp and accompanying her son. Is that a partial answer to the question, which I take very seriously and is an important one?
Thank you.
Yeah, I would add a couple of things to what you say, that this closeness, proximity, distance. Setting slaves free was a very common practice, right? But it's not recorded as much as this ransom issue. I remember Stefan Gerasimos had a huge inventory of endowments registers, and people endowed their properties either to their legal heirs, their relatives, or their freed slaves. And it was the amount of endowing to freed slaves was more than 1/4 of the whole endowments in 17th century.
But this is just Istanbul.
This is just Istanbul, we don't know the rest, but Venetians and Austrians knew about this. And so it's not a coincidence that they use this setting free thing. On the other side, there is this French romanticism that puts Sultan in a submissive way against the West. It's not a coincidence that there is a story widely believed in the 19th century that mother of Mahmud II, the reforming Sultan, was the French noblewoman Aimée de Rivière, and there is no concrete evidence suggesting, but it was believed so in France and then all over Europe that that was his mother who showed the way to Mahmud II to make his reforms all over the Ottoman Empire.
Kind of like the French.
Exactly like in the opera.
That's fascinating. I would love to know more about that. If you would give me the reference for the freeing of slaves in the Ottoman Empire, I'd love to know more about that. By the time you get to the end of the 18th century, representation of Mediterranean slavery and captivity begins to intersect with early abolitionist thinking in Europe, in both France and England under the auspices of the Enlightenment. And there's actually a work from the 70s, an opera called Der Sklavenhandel von Smyrna, by the slave dealer of Izmir, composed by the Abbe Vogler, I think from Mannheim, which has a slave dealer as its central figure. He was a basso with beautiful shimmering low notes, we know, because it was Ludwig Fischer, the same one who sang the role of Osmin for Mozart, also played the slave dealer of Izmir. And it actually takes the whole, I mean, usually, right, in an opera like the Abduction from the Seraglio, we know that there has to be some selling of these captives that takes place before the curtain goes up, because it's a subject that's too disturbing, right, to put on the stage, right? The Abbe Vogler, right, actually does create an opera which is actually about the buying and selling of slaves. And the Caravan of Cairo, right, the one that has the fabric pattern also, I mean, that caravan is a slave caravan and deals more explicitly with the subject of buying and selling slaves in a French context where enlightened people already understand that that's an important Atlantic issue as well as Mediterranean issue, and that they have to be placed side by side, the issues of slavery. That becomes quite serious even in the comic contexts that it's played out in on the operatic stage by the time you get to the end of the 18th century.
Thank you so much for this great lecture. I have a question about maybe resources, like some of your sources, or whether you know anything further about what you depicted as the representation of the Turk in the operatic stage as a kind of a symbol to be emulated by the European enlightened rulers. Like this, image, the figure of, which of course goes against everything we know about, Turkish despotism and Ukraine and everyone else. So I was wondering whether there is any high theory in your European sources that kind of lend support to that representation, that justify or depict it in the written text.
So there's a very well-known and very brilliant book on this subject by Lucette Valency, right, which probably some of you, I'm sure, are
I don't know, what is the name of the book?
The Birth of the Despot, I think.
The Birth of the Despot. The name is Valency,
It's a
Valensi. It's quite short. And it's a discussion of the ways in which, in political theory, in which we should understand European discussions about the despotism of the Ottoman Sultan as reflecting on a European debate about the nature of government and the nature of monarchy. I think it's kind of fun. It was fundamental for me in thinking about this subject and the ways in which operas about absolute authority are not merely a displacement of that issue to a remote, exotic other, but are understood to be directly relevant to a Europe that includes both the Ottoman Empire and Venice and France, are all part of the same European and in some cases Mediterranean cultural region. The other thing to say about despotism is that under that name, right, Montesquieu, treats it stigmatically, but absolute government is understood to be a positive thing through much of the 18th century in Europe. The absolute power of the prince cutting through the traditional prejudices of feudal nobles is understood to be a weapon of the Enlightenment in the 18th century. And it's not strange that Europeans would think about models of absolutism with some interest, that, and not in an entirely stigmatic way, but would be interested in what they have to offer, the ways in which they're problematic, but the ways in which they are also capable of producing reforming, moral, enlightened politics.
Thank you so much for the lecture, and to me it was very interesting when you described the Tamerlane opera. You were talking about the castrato voice and the tenor voice, and that the Turk was a tenor voice, while at the beginning of the early 18th century, like the castrato voice was supposed to be the voice of reason and the voice which is closer to the ideal portrayal of a character, and like the higher the voice basically was, the better the person portrayed was. And then later it was mostly basso voices that you were talking about, and I was just wondering how it corresponds as well with the sort of the tendency of exoticism of feminizing the East, and it just sounds like a different dynamic appearing from the castrato voice, which is the symbol of masculinity, but at the same time the East, which is the symbol of femininity or something like that, but it sort of intertwines in a very interesting way.
Very, very interesting. And one of the things that's very striking to me is looking at all of these works. It's extremely rare for a Turkish figure to sing in the castrato register. It's a countable number of very exceptional cases, usually representing young boys, right, young princes, right, who are sometimes cast as castrati. They're all, I would say almost every one of them cast in the masculine register, and a descending masculine register, beginning with the tenors, who were used for the Bayezid roles in the early 18th century, through the baritone who you heard singing the Sentimental Osman for Rameau, to the deep basso, who Mozart uses in a tradition that's then carried on by Rossini. Certainly one should understand it as the gendering of this Turkish figure as masculine and even hypermasculine. But the other thing that I'm really interested in is the ways in which you have two important discussions in play in the 18th century, both very important in European culture. One is a discussion about the valorizing of the castrato voice and its great beauty and its great expressiveness. The other is a literary and historical discussion about the role of eunuchs and the role that they play in Asian states and governments. And one of the things that's interesting to me is that operas about Turks are the place where you keep those two discussions very separate. The discussion about castrati and the discussion about eunuchs. Because if you allow them to become too close, it becomes anatomically disturbing. For instance, the figure of Osmin, whom Mozart creates in the Abduction from the Seraglio. He's the Pasha's overseer. He's the guardian of the harem. What do we know about this figure, right, if he were indeed at an Ottoman court? The guardian of the harem would very likely be a eunuch.
Necessarily.
Pardon?
Necessarily. Would necessarily be.
Would necessarily be a eunuch.
Mostly a slave from Europe.
Yes. So Mozart goes in the exact opposite direction, right? He takes us to a vocal place which is as far from being a eunuch as you can possibly be with Fischer. And he even makes a big deal out of how low Fischer can sing. That low F that you heard at the end. Right, no, none of us can do it. It's so low. But my theory is that ich habe auch Verstand, right? I also have a mind, right? Should also be understood as I also have testicles, right? And that what he's actually telling us is that by the way that Mozart vocalizes him, is that I am not a eunuch, and that's part of keeping those two discussions carefully separate.
If I just follow up on that particular point, because the low bass by the time Mozart got it was a basso buffo. It was inherently a comic character. There was no, and there's usually a highly satirical component to all of the basso buffo characters. Like they're not really perceived as characters that can have the kinds of dimensions that the mezzo carattere can have. So in a sense, in that sense, he's kind of castrated of a certain kind of subjectivity, you might say. Like he's just by the vocal casting. It's not possible to.
Well, all I'll say about it is that Rossini totally flips it around when he uses it from a Maometto Secondo, right? He comes back to opera seria using the bass voice and uses it to create a charismatic conqueror who must be taken seriously, about whom there is nothing comical at all. I think it's a little bit of a flexible tool for the composers who use the basso voice to explore Turkishness in the late 18th and early 19th century, but I take your point.
Yeah, I wondered if it might have been a satirical thing for him to say, how about Verstanden, whether that was intended to be a serious claim or whether it was like something that the Viennese audience would have laughed at as a joke and that it was sort of intended that way. That's kind of my question about it.
I think it's probably a little bit on the line and a little bit the way it's performed. So we did an event around the book at NYU with with live performers. And the bass who came and sung Some of Us Means Music, who had sung the role on stage, often, right? What he said about Osmin is that you have to take him seriously because if you look at the way the libretto is structured, he's always falling into rages about his suspicions about the European characters, but that every time he does that, right, the libretto shows us that he's actually right, and that all of his suspicious rages are totally justified, that they are plotting against him in exactly the way that he thinks they are, and that appropriately you should sing his music with dignity. Right, this is someone who actually sings the role and made a case for it, but you don't sing the role for the laughs. I thought it was interesting because obviously we've seen it done either way. Right? We know we can go in multiple directions with that character. It's part of what makes him so great.
Thank you very much.